Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you're watching live or you're watching in the recording, I appreciate you watching. And today we are talking about the curse of knowledge. We're continuing in Module 4 today. And the idea, or part of the idea, one of the things that we discuss in Module 4, as you're reading your Don Norman book, The Design of Everyday Things, one of the things that Don Norman covers in Chapter 3, which is what we're reading here in Module 4, is the idea of knowledge of versus knowledge how. And so we're going to talk about kind of what this means and how we apply it to our website builds, and really kind of how it can help us in everyday life or in many different types of jobs if we think about it in that sort of way. Right, there are a lot of different ways that we can apply these ideas of knowledge of and knowledge how to help us out. And this probably, I highly doubt we'll take the entire hour today. This will probably be pretty quick, because it's basically just me talking about these theories. So, there we go. First of all, one of the things that we want to talk about is kind of the responsibility that we have when it comes to the idea of knowledge and our audience and the things that we're considering when we're considering our audience, right? Like all of this stuff kind of ties together, right? So this goes back to some of the things that we were talking about in Module 2 and Module 3, when we're kind of talking about who our audience is and what we're learning from that. as we kind of progress into coming up with what our idea for a design could or should be. Right, and then bigger than that, we have a responsibility for introducing someone for the very first time to something new. Right? Because the website that we create, the design that we make, it's brand new. There might be a lot of other things that are like it, right? Or a lot of other similar things that exist that are similar to the website that we build. And when we do that, we take advantage of something called web patterns, which is something else that we'll talk about in future live sessions. But the idea of a website being a new web design, we have created this new thing, we've brought it into the world, and as a result, we are introducing something to our audience for the very first time. And so we have to think about what that means in terms of what our audience should be able to know to do. Right? So we need to be able to make the user understand everything about our site. And how do we do that? Well, we do that in part through some of the things that we've talked about in previous weeks, right? We're talking about affordances, we're talking about signifiers, we're talking about feedback. All of these things sort of working together in a design system. But there are some inherent dangers in this that we need to watch out for. Right? And a big part of this is the idea that our understanding of a system and our users' understanding of a system is always going to be incongruous. It's always going to be lopsided. Right? Because we built the system. So inherently, we know more about the system that we built than the users that we're having come to our site to use it. But as individuals who build the site, oftentimes one of the things that we see is we're too close to the project. Right? We have intimate knowledge of the project as we've gone through building it. We've coded in every little button and every little interaction. We've built it ourselves. So we're very used to and very accustomed to how the website works, how it should be interacted with, what you're supposed to do with it. And that knowledge clouds your thinking. And it inhibits this responsibility that we're talking about here as we're introducing something brand new to our users for the very first time. And so we have a term for this, right? It's called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias, right? We can define the curse of knowledge basically as the ability to assume people would know the things that you know. Right? So if we put this in context with a website, right? We built the site, so we have an intimate knowledge of how the site works. And just by default, as a result, we might think it's intuitive. We might think it's self-explanatory. Even though really, like from our perspective, it's not self-explanatory, right? Because we've been explaining it to ourselves as we've been developing it and designing it, right? And this is where we get into some of the concepts that we've talked about previously when we talk about design as an iterative process, right? Because if I just walk into things with assumption, and this, again, gets back to some things that we've talked about before. Assumptions are antithetical. They are in opposition to what we're trying to do as designers. Right? Which is also the reason why, like a lot of times, even designers will hire other designers to build things for them, to build logos for them, to build websites for them, to design whatever for them. Because they don't have that closeness. They don't have that connection to the things they're trying to do. So it's easier for them to see how a regular user would interact. So it's a cognitive bias. We know what we know. Our users don't know what we know, but we assume that they know what we know. And when that happens, it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle for us to kind of consider that difference in knowledge. It's a struggle for us to kind of consider the gulfs of knowledge in the head, knowledge in the world, gulf of execution, all these sorts of different things that we've been talking about. It's hard for us to consider those things and fix them in the processes that we're building, right? And so I always talk about an interesting study when I talk about this, and that's the concept of the tappers and the listeners. It's been a while back now, right? This is an older study, but it was at Stanford University. A graduate student named Elizabeth Newton performed a study that they called tappers and listeners, right? And it basically illustrates perfectly the idea of the curse of knowledge, and it does so by just asking subjects in the study to play a simple game, right? So you take a group of subjects for the study, and this is where if we were in a seated class, I would do this with you and we'd have a lot of fun with it. But you take two groups of people. One group of people are the tappers. The other group of people are the listeners. And the tappers are given a song, right? And, to make sure that it's legitimate, it'd have to be something that they would know. So think about like nursery rhyme songs, think about, different things like that. So maybe they'd be handed a slip of paper with a song on it that they would know, and they would be asked to tap it on the table. And then the listeners were asked to listen and figure out that song based on what the tappers were tapping and no other information, right? You're just tapping. So you might hear something like, let me try to do this close to the mic. Now, in my head, right, the purpose of the experiment here is kind of clear because in my head, I knew exactly what song I was tapping. But I didn't say what song, I didn't tell you what song I was tapping. And so as you were listening to it there, maybe you were trying to think about it. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll tap it again. And this time kind of listen to it and think about it. Now in my head, very clear. Right? Because I was kind of singing it along in my head as I was tapping it. And it was even making the pencil sound as I was tapping against my desk in my own head, like it had its own tune to it. Like it didn't. Like it was just me tapping a pencil against my desk. And as you were listening to it, maybe you kind of got an idea of what it was. Maybe you think you know. Maybe you feel confident that you know. But maybe you had no idea. I was trying to tap happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear so-and-so. Happy birthday to you. Right? In my head, super clear. In yours, maybe not so much. Right? So what was astonishing out of this study came as the results here. Right? And the results. We can see here that roughly half of the people estimated, or I should say, the tappers estimated 50% of the time that the person that was listening to the tapping would get the song correctly. Or would get the song correct. 50% of the time, right? They say, at least 50% of them probably understood what was going on. They probably knew what song I was tapping. When the actual number of correct guesses came through, it was less than 5%. Right? And that gets back to the idea that we were just talking about there, right? Is this idea that, like, in my head, as I was tapping that, it was super clear. But in your head, you were struggling and you were trying to make ends meet, trying to figure things out. Right? So what's our conclusion from this? Well, we can't assume things. Right? Because assumptions are going to lead to the gulfs. Right? Our gulf of execution is going to widen if we make assumptions, because we're going to believe that we've bridged that gulf when our bridge has kind of been cut in half and dangling like a rope bridge in a cartoon. Right? When we are knowledgeable and experienced and skilled in a certain topic or domain, we tend to assume that other people also acquire the same knowledge, experience, and skills as us. And even bigger than that, and this is something that might help you relate to some of your instructors a little bit better, at the pace of us. Right? So like if I'm a really skilled math professor or if I'm a programming professor, because I'll admit that I'm guilty of this sometimes. Sometimes I have to tell myself, like, hey, just because you know it doesn't mean that other people know it. Like, slow down a little bit. It's okay. Take some extra time. Help them figure it out. Because when you have these skills, you assume that people can also acquire the same knowledge, the same experience, the same skills as we have, and do it at the same pace that we do. Now, I do my best not to do that, right? That's why some of the assignments in some of my classes are the way that they are. Some students are able to finish them in, under an hour. Some others it takes, several hours. And, I have the understanding that, everybody kind of approaches programming and these topics at different rates, right? And that's just sort of the way things are. So with that consideration, we want to make sure we keep things like that in mind, right? We can't just make assumptions that people are going to come onto our website and just everything's going to be as intuitive as we immediately think it is as we're developing it. And instead, we need to do some testing. So this is where we get to the point of knowledge of versus knowledge how. Right? So how does all this come back to the idea of knowledge of versus knowledge how? And it falls back to the idea of knowledge in the head versus knowledge in the world, right? These are all, our big concepts from the Don Norman book that we've been reading. Chapters 1 and 2 of that book, you were introduced to the topic of the knowledge in the head versus the knowledge in the world. And when we say knowledge is knowledge in the world, what we mean there is the information needed to relate to something or do a task is readily available in the world. So you remember that responsibility that we talked about a little while ago? that we're introducing something brand new to people who have never seen that thing before? So if we're operating under the assumption that we are responsible for introducing something that's brand new to people who have never seen it before, is the information that's needed to relate to that thing or that task readily available in the world? If it's brand new and nobody's ever seen it before, no. It doesn't exist. Now, we can take advantage of that on some smaller levels with things like web patterns, right? Because like if I have a drop down on my site, you've seen a drop down on dozens, maybe hundreds of other websites. And so you know how a drop down works in general principle. But you may not exactly know how that drop down works, which creates challenges. Right? So what we end up with here is the introduction of knowledge. If we're responsible for introducing our target audience to something new, we are responsible for putting that knowledge into the world. So that knowledge is not in the world yet. We can't say or assume that that knowledge is present, that that's knowledge in the world, because we haven't put it out there yet. It's our job to put that knowledge in the world. But is the knowledge that we're introducing here, is that knowledge of something or knowledge of how to do something? Knowledge of or knowledge how? And, that's really cloudy because the answer there is it depends, right? It depends on what we're doing, whether or not the knowledge that we're putting into the world when we introduce a new website to our users is knowledge of or knowledge how. So when we're looking at it from the frame of reference of knowledge of is declarative knowledge, right? These are facts, these are rules, these are easy to write down and teach. Got a few examples here, right? Like D is the fourth letter of the alphabet. Knowledge of, and that's knowledge in the world. Raleigh is the capital of North Carolina. 2 + 2 = 4. Knowledge of is explicit. If you know it, you know it. And if you don't know it, you may or may not know you don't know it. You might be confident in your wrong answer, but if you know it, you know it because it's declarative, right? It's easy to write down. It's easy to teach. It is concrete. So maybe your website fits that description, right? Maybe the content of your website is more knowledge of, just declarative facts that you're introducing into the world. Knowledge how, on the other hand, is procedural knowledge. Knowledge that's largely subconscious, that's difficult to write down. You do it, you learn more of knowledge how through practice, through demonstration, through hands-on. Right? So like when you are 15 years old, you can take driver's ed and you can learn knowledge of driving a car. Right? You can learn all these serious facts and figures, all the hard factual things. You're supposed to wear your seatbelt. You're supposed to use your turn signal before you turn. You're supposed to stop at a stop sign, whatever. But you're not a fully licensed driver after gaining that knowledge of. It's only after gaining knowledge how that you become a fully licensed driver. It's only after you've had practice and you're able to demonstrate that you know how to do it, that you're able to move from having a learner's permit to having a full driver's license. Putting together a desk chair, right? Like I can have knowledge of how to put together a desk chair. You take the bolt and you screw it in and, it's. But I don't necessarily know how to do that unless I've actually done it. Put my hands on it. Right, because as you probably know, right, especially as we've gone through like different programming processes, I can have general knowledge of how programming works. But then when I go to write a program, I might struggle a little more. I might not have enough knowledge how. And what's interesting to me here is that this last bullet point here, when knowledge how is acquired, it tends to become implicit or subconscious is a good term here. Right? After you've driven a car for so long, driving just kind of becomes second nature. And, that's one of the things that it can actually make. That's why the majority of accidents actually occur closer to people's homes. Is because that's the area that you're more comfortable in. That's the area that you have more knowledge how to get around. And so when something introduces itself that you're not expecting, you're kind of you're on a subconscious flow mode. You're not in a heightened state of awareness. So you know it and you don't know that you know it. You just know it. It's just in there and you're just able to do it. Right? It becomes a second nature. And so this is where taking advantage of web patterns kind of helps us out, right? Because I fill out enough web forms, I gain knowledge how to fill out a web form. I'm presented with a new web form. I can just type my stuff in, move on. Right? But there are challenges to building this knowledge. Right? And in 2016, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, conducted a study. And this study found that only 1/3 of adults could successfully complete medium complexity tasks. Now, what these medium complexity tasks were, these were website-based tasks or computer-based tasks, right? They were asked to navigate across pages and between different applications, to take multiple steps, as well as use different tools and different software features toward finding a solution. Right? So it's not just a simple one-page start to finish. It's a big process that might involve multiple pieces of software, computerized, and involves specific features of some of that software. Right? In addition, the activities required inferential reasoning and evaluation of information for relevance. So not only were you given a medium complex task, so not an ultra complex task, not something super hard, something that maybe you should be able to do, but you'd have to think about it. You also weren't presented with everything you need to know in order to be able to do the task. Some things you had to infer. Some things you kind of had to figure out on your own. Evaluation of information for relevance. What that means is that they would put some things in there that were red herrings. Some things would be in the instructions that you would not need to know in order to be able to do your task. All right, so let's think about that again in terms of, and just kind of break down what people were being asked to do. A medium complexity task where they had to use different web pages and different documents and different pieces of software to do something that also required using specific software features to progress toward a solution. Say, you have to go to several different websites to get information on some sort of data-based thing. You have to put it into a spreadsheet. You have to sort that spreadsheet or do some calculations to that spreadsheet. Maybe generate a chart. And type some findings up in a Word document. Right, and it might have some steps left out that you'd need to do. It might have some extra things in there that wouldn't be relevant that you'd have to kind of pick through and figure out what was relevant and what was not. right? So that was kind of what subjects were asked to do in the study. From there, what we learned is that when users struggled to complete research tasks, it was often due to a website or application's failure. Let me repeat that. When users struggled to complete their research tasks, it was often due to a website or application's failure, not the users. It wasn't some shortcoming of the user that they didn't have the ability to necessarily do something. It was a failure of the website or application, because at the heart of those failures was a lack of understanding of the user's goals and information needs. So as a result, the website would provide insufficient information or sufficient information but in the wrong structure, or being delivered through the wrong method. So we're not getting our affordances, signifiers, and feedback, right? This is the way we can frame that. Either A, insufficient information, we're not getting our affordances, signifiers, and feedback, which leads to task derailment, which leads to uncertainty in decision-making, task abandonment, right? If your users don't know how to use your website, they'll just leave. They'll just leave and they won't think another thing about it, right? And they won't be complaining about their inability to do something. They'll be complaining about how your website is bad. Interesting. Right, so a lack of affordances, a lack of information, a lack of feedback, a lack of signifiers. That's insufficient information. But then you have the right information but the wrong delivery. Remember those Norman doors we talked about a couple of weeks ago? Right? You end up with an unclear system image or an incomplete system image. I'm pushing the pull door. Right? So when I'm pushing the pull door, I've got the information that I need, but I'm not getting it in the right way. I know I'm supposed to do something with this door. All indicators are that I'm supposed to push it, but I'm supposed to pull it. My presentation model is all out of whack. I'm not using my CRAP principles properly, which we'll talk about in a future module. Contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. I'm not considering my affordances, signifiers, and feedback in the right way, so I'm ending up with my Norman doors. My users are confused. And then you get into the same position that you're in here with insufficient information. Is bad information is just as bad or maybe even worse than no information. It's going to lead to these same outcomes: task derailment, uncertainty in decision making, task abandonment. Right, so in the pursuit of performing our responsibility, we cannot assume knowledge. In doing so, we take that knowledge and we put it out in the world. Right? It's our responsibility to put that knowledge out in the world. And so the type of knowledge that could be needed in these cases could be knowledge of, could be knowledge how, could be both. So we not only have to be aware of providing all the information we need, but that we're providing it in a context that is correct, that is easily understood, that makes sense in context. But knowledge is a bit of a tricky thing, right? Because knowledge changes. Knowledge changes as the world changes. Right? Knowledge in the head, knowledge in the world. If knowledge in the world is common knowledge that just exists because, we all kind of encounter it regularly. If the world changes and we stop encountering something with regularity, the knowledge leave. What? What? Huh? The knowledge leaves? Yeah. Think about it. Right? One of the most common points of controversy nowadays, cursive writing. When I was younger, and when some of you maybe were younger, second, third, fourth grade, you were taught how to write in cursive. Well, thanks to the prolific nature of cell phones and computers and typing things up, cursive writing went down low on the priority list. So now all of a sudden, right, the world changes. Because cursive writing was at one time really important, because the quickest way that you could write something would be writing it in cursive. You could write it down really, really quickly and keep going. But now, people can type way faster than they can write in general. So typing kind of usurps that. And all of a sudden we're complaining because kids don't know how to write in cursive. The world changed. The need for something changed. And the knowledge left or is leaving. Right? Because presumably there'll come a point where, the majority of the people who have the skill, have the knowledge how, are gone. Right? Fact of life. And then it's not being re-implemented. It's not being retaught. It's not being put back out into the world. And then it's just gone. The knowledge is left. And so if some of the practices, some of the things that you use on your website, if that knowledge leaves, if people stop using that particular feature, if people stop using that particular thing generally, then something that was knowledge in the world is gone. Gone. So not only can we not assume knowledge, but we can't always assume knowledge is going to be there either. And we need to be flexible and we need to be adaptable with the time. We need to be able to break the curse of knowledge. So we need to have awareness. What's going on in general in terms of web pattern? What are the current web design patterns? How are we maintaining our professional development? Right? You might think that school is something that you do, for a couple of years while you're trying to get a degree, and then you can just quit learning and you can go be a pro. But that's not the case, right? If you want to be good at what you do, you always have to be learning. Because it always requires a certain level of awareness of what's going on in the world in order for you to be able to know how you do things and how you implement things. You need to know your users, right? You need to know what they're looking for. What are their information goals? Why are they coming to your website? Right? That's one of the whole reasons behind why, a couple weeks ago, as we were talking about, doing surveys and A/B testing and all that kind of fun stuff, right? We're figuring out who our users are and we're getting feedback. from our users to make sure that what we think their goals actually are. Explain in detail, right? Don't just assume the knowledge, explain it. It might annoy some of your users, your power users, right? Because they're going to know how to do the thing, but the vast majority of your users aren't those power users. And so it's going to be better if you explain it. Even better still than if you present it with visuals. Not everybody's a great reader. Some people read real fast and they can comprehend and everything just kind of clicks. Others, not so much, right? And that's just the way that we are in general, right? Is this idea that, you know, some people are good at some things, some people are better at some things than others. And so one of the things that we'll talk about in a future module is the idea of an outlier. Who an outlier is, what an outlier is. But like the important thing out of that when it comes to web design is the idea that there's no such thing as an outlier. As we're designing a website, we're designing the website for the people that are using our site, right? We get back to the idea of human-centered design. It all builds. The humans at the core of our decision-making to build our websites. And even if we're great readers and we can generally read and comprehend, sometimes we have a real bad day and things just aren't clicking. Our brain's kind of foggy. We just don't have it figured out yet. So some visuals are going to help. And then when you get all that data and you're able to kind of use it together with everything, you can actually start to predict user behavior. Based on the knowledge of, based on your awareness, based on your knowledge of your users, based on the feedback that you've gotten in the past, you could start predicting user behavior and getting more outcomes that are better for what you can do. And that's what I have for you today. So this is something that, I want you to kind of think about, right? All of this, I want you to kind of think about these ideas. Again, one of the things that we've talked about in the past is that this is a highly theory-based course. So we talk more about theory in this course than anything else, in terms of how we implement designs and how we think about design. Last week, we did a little something that was a little more hands-on in terms of how we use color. I urge you to go back and kind of revisit that from last week. That'll help you out with your color lab. That's due on Thursday. But that's all that I have for you for today. We'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. If you're watching the recording and you have any questions, please send me an email or a Teams message. I'd be more than happy to answer them. Just as an update, all of your assignments that have been submitted for Module 3 have been graded. I waited until today to grade the discussion board assignment because of the issues with it. All those issues are fixed now, so if you want to see, if you haven't yet and you wanted to see what my blog post was supposed to be, I encourage you all to go check that out. But I'll hang out in the chat for just a few minutes in case anybody's here with me again has any questions. That's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.